Hello and welcome to Pedagogical Dialogues, an educational podcast making teaching and learning more transparent. Pedagogical Dialogues is an educational podcast typically addressing topics in the area of curriculum, assessment, and instruction, specifically for those who have an interest in teaching English as an additional language. My name is Benjamin Stewart at benjaminlstewart.net, and today we want to look at the question, how does asynchronous instruction compare to face-to-face instruction? Are they the same? Are we even asking the right questions? That's going to be our topic for today. We're going to unpack this question and reflect on our own educational philosophy as teachers helping other learners become better communicators of the English language. Today, we want to look at this question and see how it relates to our own teaching practice. Before we get into today's topic, if you have any thoughts, insights, or want to share any of your experiences, feel free to reach out to me at my Twitter handle at BNLEEZ or any of my socials listed at the top of my website at benjaminlstewart.net. Today's question, how does asynchronous instruction compare to face-to-face instruction, came from a recent podcast I was listening to called Teach for Teaching. You can check out their website at teachforteaching.com. In episode 235, week 109, they were discussing about their recent experiences over the last couple of years with COVID, some of the challenges that they were facing, and looking forward, what kind of implications the last couple of years might have had for each of them. And one of the things that stood out to me as listening to this podcast were some of the problems that they were addressing, such as less time for professional development, less time to interact with colleagues, less time to catch up on their own reading, just overall less time to prepare for classes. There also seemed to be more time spent on keeping up with the latest news, maybe the latest medical reports, now more currently the war in Ukraine, and all of that really as a cause of possible stress for both teachers and students. Some of the challenges that they were discussing related to mental health issues and making sure that we as teachers are more receptive and more aware of possible mental issues that students might be going through. There also seem to be greater differences in the quality and the quantity of student work. I know I've seen that in my own teaching practice where some students, there just seems to be a difference between some students who are creating a lot of work, producing a lot of work, whereas others have not. And also, I think that there's just a wider variety of the quality of work that's being created or produced on the part of the student. So really, in my experience, I've seen where some students are really taking on to these new approaches to teaching and learning as we went to more of an online course and later more of a hybrid or flex class. I've seen students who are actually producing a lot of good work and actively participating, whereas other students, there certainly is a change. And maybe it could be related to problems with just having access to technology or access to the internet. And there are, of course, additional stresses that are related to perhaps health issues. And so I've seen a wide variety of cases. Some students who have really taken on this new approach quite well, and others who have seen some challenges in that regard. Another comment that stood out was just this difference between student motivation in terms of what goes on inside the class versus what goes on outside of the class. Whereas students perhaps are less motivated to take part in activities outside of class versus activities that are in the class that they tend to be more motivated. Overall, and I can certainly relate to this, a lack of focus from the students or among the students. Also, students just have more distractions. When they're online, maybe they're at home, maybe they're or other family members that are taking part in different activities in the moment that they are attending class. And there's just a lot of opportunities to get distracted. And I know I've seen that also, that is a major challenge and can drastically influence student motivation. But one thing that stood out, one comment that was made, and if you want to take a look at this comment in context, you can locate it at T for Teaching, episode 235, at 26 minutes and 33 seconds. The comment was made that asynchronous and face-to-face instruction are basically equivalent. And this is what I'd like to kind of unpack what it is that we're comparing. I often hear comparisons like online learning is not as good as face-to-face, or face-to-face is better than online learning. I've also heard the opposite. Online learning can be a lot better for some students versus face-to-face. But I want to talk about a few points when we're talking about comparing different types of instruction or different types of classes or different types of learning. And I want to address specifically this idea towards the English language learning classroom. That is the classroom where we're helping learners develop their English proficiency skills, English as an additional language. So in that context, or within that context, we're focusing on the 4 skills, of course: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. We're focusing on grammar and vocabulary and pronunciation, prosody in terms of intonation, rhythm, the rhythm of the language. And of course, we're also including critical thinking. So how students collaborate and cooperate and build consensus. We're helping decision-making, helping students go through that process of decision-making, resolving cognitive conflict, perhaps, problem setting, problem solution, and so on. Now, within that context, depending on the focus of those language domains or linguistic domains, and also thinking domains, the first thing to think about is the type of communication that's taking part in the class. So we can usually categorize these 2 types of communication in terms of synchronous versus asynchronous communication. Synchronous communication being live communication in the moment, interactions are occurring in real time, whether offline or online. Asynchronous communication, whether it's online or offline, it could relate to, again, interactions or communication in text form or in audio, video form, but it occurs over time. So maybe thinking of it in terms of a forum. If you're familiar with Flipgrid, typically the response videos that are being uploaded to Flipgrid would offer an example of asynchronous communication in the form of audio and or video. It could also be, of course, in most social media context, if we're thinking about Twitter or Facebook, those comments typically are asynchronous. Now, we could get into a semi-structured asynchronous situation, perhaps where maybe those comments are occurring almost in the moment. So one could argue that it could be a combination of synchronous, semi-synchronous, and asynchronous communication when it comes to, for example, Twitter responses. And it just depends on the time frame and how that occurs, whether it's in the moment where it's almost like a conversation that's happening live, right? So, or maybe it's a asynchronous situation where maybe responses are occurring hours later, maybe even days later. So we have these 2 types of communication, asynchronous and synchronous, but we also then need to think about the delivery of the instruction or the class or the teaching or the learning, however we want to frame it. We can think of delivery in 2 general categories as well, as being offline and online. As I mentioned before, synchronous and asynchronous communication can occur both online and offline. So offline delivery would be face-to-face or in-person interactions versus online would be remote interactions occurring, again, either synchronous or asynchronously. So we have types of communication, we have types of delivery. We also need to think of the types of, or the theories that are being involved in our classroom. What type of theory relates to the learning or the teaching or the interactions that are taking place? This has a lot to do with also the educational philosophy of the instructor. What's your educational philosophy? What do you teach? Why do you teach? How do you teach? When do you teach? Where do you teach? To whom do you teach? Answering those questions and thinking and reflecting on your own educational philosophy relates very much to also the theories that you might adhere to. Behaviorism, cognitivism, social constructivism, connectivism, whichever theories you are using or applying to your day-to-day teaching practice is also a very important factor when you're thinking about, well, what's better, right? If we're looking at a classroom situation that's completely online, then we also have to ask also what kinds of communication are we including? How much of it is asynchronous? How much of it is synchronous? And also, at the same time, think of the theories that are applicable to that experience. We need to think of these three collectively: the types of communication, types of delivery, and the theories or one's educational philosophy that are included in that experience. Now, the last thing to think about is context. So beyond the types of communication, beyond the delivery, the educational philosophy and theory, decisions are typically made by the individual teacher, but usually within some kind of learning context. Maybe a learning community or culture of the institution, of maybe the homes, the learners. They have their own way of learning. And also within just the local society itself. Context really is important in terms of how teachers are making decisions and to the degree with which they can make those decisions in terms of synchronous or the forms of communication, the delivery, and the theory. The last thing to think about as it relates to context relates to resources. How much time do we have? How much time do we have for the interactions in class itself versus also how much time do we have to plan those experiences? Technology, materials, and also just one's knowledge and understanding, okay, whether it's from the teacher and or the students, but the ideas, the beliefs, the thoughts, the understandings that the teacher has, all of those resources, along with the learning community and culture of the institution or the school and the home and also the local society, all of that context has a lot to do with decisions that we make when it comes to the types of communication, delivery, and the theory. So when we're comparing what's better, online or offline, it really does depend on the types of communication that's one is implementing. If we're thinking about a technology, a tool, it's not enough to think of a particular tool in isolation. We need to think about, well, how are we going to use it? What kinds of communication are we trying to achieve? How are we delivering this information, these interactions, this content, the learning, the instruction? And what kind of theories relate to all of this in terms of, again, the tool that we're considering? There are a lot of different entry points. If we're thinking about grammar, we're planning our class. If you're thinking about your next lesson and you know you need to focus on, let's say, the present tense, the simple present, and we're thinking about the type of situation that we're trying to create, the educative experience that we're trying to design for our students, these are questions that need to come up. What kind of communication are we expecting? It could be the types of communication for that particular lesson or that particular unit or that particular task or performance. How are we delivering all of the interactions, the learning, the teaching? What kind of theory or theories, plural, are best represented within or throughout that experience? Okay, so again, regardless of how the entry point into your lesson plan, I think it's important, if we're going to be comparing and we're evaluating and assessing or even just reflecting on our own experiences and making a judgment as to whether or not something went well or not, we need to think about the types of communication that we're expecting, the delivery with which we are expecting this educative experience to unfold, and also the theory, the philosophy, the educational philosophy that we are respecting, and also the theories that we feel answer the simple question, well, how do learners learn best? How do English language learners best acquire a language, an additional language? And those assumptions are going to be rooted in the theory or theories that we are subscribing to. So I leave you with the following question. How do philosophy, theory, delivery, and communication come together in such a way that learning outcomes are achievable? If you want to share your experiences, feel free to reach out to me at my socials, located at the top of my website at benjaminlstewart.net. You've been listening to Pedagogical Dialogues, an educational podcast, making teaching and learning more transparent. Thanks for listening.